Does he need to do a better job of quote unquote being a leader, or was he just kind of brought down with the sinking ship last year?
Yeah, to me, it's all about authenticity. And so it's like, well, who are you? Be that person. Because when you try to fake it, then your teammates know, coaches know, and it just like, that's not going to help your cause at all. Now, having said that, you would have liked at some point when you mentioned it, a sinking ship last year. Do you have a leader who can bring everyone together and say, we got to get this fixed? We're not going out like that. What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
Is the Eagles' collapse enough to light a fire under Jalen Hurts' butt? And speaking of Jalen Hurts' butt, will pushing it be harder this year without Jason Kelce? Oh, and the Eagles have added some Saquon guy to the mix as well. Sheil Kapadia of the Ringers Philly Special joined me to discuss all that and more. I'm Joe Dolan. This is Franchise Focus. 32 teams, 32 interviews. Sheil, obviously you've been through no pun intended here. You've been through the ringer with the Eagles the last few years, and the ups, the downs, the everything in between. You know, the tweet that says there are only two speeds to Philadelphia fans: cocky and distraught. It feels like that is exactly what the 2023 Eagles season was. And they didn't go full clean house because they brought Nick Sirianni back. But for the purposes of this podcast, we want to talk about the offense. And you witnessed it firsthand. You watched the tape. Your co-host Ben Solak watched the tape. In your opinion, what was the biggest difference between the 2023 Eagles offense and the 2022 Eagles offense? And how confident are you that they can fix that for 2024?
Yeah, I think it was just a lack of problem solving was really the thing. You know, you looked at how defenses attacked them as they fell apart down the stretch, and it was blitz after blitz after blitz after blitz. And it's like you watch it one week, you talk about it on our Ringers Philly Special podcast about, hey, here, look at these. They had no idea how to solve this problem. And then the next week, the same thing happens again. And so coaching was obviously a big, big factor. I mean, you look at the talent they had on that offense last year, and you look at the results they produced specifically, again, in that 6 or 7 game stretch to end the season and in the playoffs. And it's huge that they underachieved. So now you're bringing a new offensive coordinator in Kellen Moore. And it's just like you need more answers to the problems that defenses are throwing your way. It's been a very basic offense. It's not a high volume playbook. It's a, hey, go back to the same passing concepts over and over and over again, because you've got AJ Brown and Devonta Smith and you've got good players. But at some point you have to help the players out a little bit more. And that wasn't happening last year.
Yeah, I think we've seen with dating back to the Chip Kelly years, the two extremes with the Eagles of talent beats scheme and scheme beats talent. We've seen both extremes from the Eagles, and they have to find that balance. Talking to Kellen Moore, I think we just got to hear from him for the first time as the Eagles offensive coordinator, and studying his offense from the years with the Cowboys and the Chargers. Obviously, you're intimately familiar with that as well. What do you think are some of the things that he can bring to the Eagles, specifically to the Eagles personnel and what they have offensively to offer? And what can Kellen Moore do differently that maybe Brian Johnson did last year?
Yeah, it's funny. It's like some of the basic things you see offenses do in the year 2024. The Eagles were not doing them last year. For example, using motion. Oh my gosh, what a novel call. Amazing. What is this? The guy moves before the snap, wait behind the... Literally, I think the Eagles were 37. They were at least bottom 5 in the NFL last year in doing that. This is something Kellen Moore has done at his various stops with the Chargers in Dallas. So it's kind of little stuff like that, honestly, where you say, hey, could you need to stack the receivers? Do you need more bunches with the receivers on offense? Can you use motion before the snap to get favorable matchups? I mean, there was too much last year of just isolate a guy on the outside and, hey, we've got AJ Brown and you don't. And listen, sometimes that's good enough to score 30 points. We've all seen it. Like, yeah, that has to be part of your offense in the NFL, but it's those easy buttons, those times where you just want to say, hey, let's help out the quarterback a little bit. Let's make the picture a little bit clearer. I think those are the things that they want Kellen Moore to kind of modernize this offense that was too traditional, too outdated, too vanilla last season.
We're not in the business of muckraking here on the Franchise Focus series at Fantasy Points, but everybody loves Jalen Hurts' even keel demeanor when the Eagles are winning 13 football games. When the Eagles are in the midst of a historic collapse, nobody seems to like Jalen Hurts' even keel demeanor. Without knowing exactly how the Eagles feel inside the building about Jalen Hurts, where do you fall on that spectrum? Does he need to do a better job of quote unquote being a leader, or was he just kind of brought down with the sinking ship last year?
Yeah, to me, it's all about authenticity. And so it's like, well, who are you? Be that person. Because when you try to fake it, then your teammates know, coaches know, and it just like, that's not going to help your cause at all. Now, having said that, you would have liked at some point when you mentioned it, a sinking ship last year. Do you have a leader who can bring everyone together and say, we got to get this fixed? We're not going out like that. And listen, maybe they tried that. And sometimes you're just not good enough. Like we have a hard time coming to that conclusion in sports where sometimes the team's just not good enough and they don't have answers. And it has nothing to do with a fiery speech or a guy's demeanor or anything like that. So I think it's probably a little overstated, but at the same time, stuff does come with getting paid that monster contract and being a franchise quarterback in a city like Philadelphia, where sometimes you do need to step up. So it's kind of a fine line, but usually it's just dependent on, is the team winning? Is the team losing?
Yeah, Jalen Hurts still, by the way, carrying an ADP of a top 3 fantasy quarterback, as you might anticipate, but there's a certain play that the Eagles use, the tush push, very nasty. They push you around with their big, strong guys. Are they going to be able to execute that as well without Jason Kelce this year?
It's a great question. I don't have an answer to it. And we're not going to know in OTAs. We're not going to know in training camp. We're not going to know in the preseason. We're not going to know until the season starts. And so we'll see. I mean, physically, like Cam Jerkins, they drafted him as kind of a Jason Kelce clone. He's a little undersized. He can move. He can get out in space. He's athletic. He can do all those things. I don't know. Like we all watch the tush push, and it's not like anybody has this great X's and O's breakdown for why it works. I mean, Jason Kelce got real low. He knows how to use his leverage. Jalen Hurts can squat 600 pounds, which they'll tell you on every Eagles broadcast for every game you watch. And you have two strong guys and know how to use their leverage, and they can pick up a yard. But it is a big factor for fantasy for Hurts. I mean, he's got 38 rushing touchdowns the last 3 seasons. Tops in the NFL. And it was just like, they would just want to get to 3rd and 1, 4th and 1, extend the drive, do it again. It's almost like they were playing 1st and 9 a lot of times last season. So it's a big factor. There's no doubt about it.
And now, obviously, you mentioned squatting 600 pounds for Jalen Hurts. One of the things that has gone viral this offseason for the Eagles is they showed Jalen Hurts looking just like a proud father watching Saquon Barkley squat 600 pounds in the weight room here. Saquon Barkley, first and foremost, we're going to have to discuss his role in a follow-up question. But do you think Saquon Barkley, though this really hasn't been his game, do you think he could take some of that short yardage work away from Jalen Hurts this year?
I don't know that they're going to ask him to, be used in that role. Is he capable of it? Maybe, but I do think their preference would be, hey, just, we have this play that works great with the quarterback. Let's not overthink it until teams show they can stop it. Let's just continue to use Jalen Hurts in that role. So, I would think they would want Saquon Barkley as more that explosive threat, pass catcher to do the other things that you need answers to rather than the short yardage role.
The Eagles are obviously very analytically inclined, one of the most analytically forward-thinking organizations in the NFL, though Howie Roseman has shown the flexibility to kind of step outside those bounds from time to time. He's very aggressive in trading up and back in the draft, maybe when analytically the suggestions would be to always trade back. Nonetheless, the Eagles then come out, at least they surprised me a little bit in paying Saquon Barkley this offseason. What was your reaction to the Eagles signing Saquon Barkley, and how have you parsed what maybe Howie Roseman and Nick Sirianni have said about adding a player like him to the offense?
Yeah, I was really surprised. It's out of character from what they've done in really during the entire Howie Roseman regime. And so, the cap goes up obviously. And so it's what they're saying, hey, $12.5 million per year now is not what it was 5 years ago. They're looking at guys like Gabe Davis who are getting $13 million per year. And they're saying, hey, we would rather have a guy like Saquon Barkley to add to our offense than a guy like Gabe Davis. So I was surprised just because he's missed 22 games the past 4 seasons. He's had 704 carries the past 3 seasons. we just have seen this time and again. When has it really worked out that you pay a guy, a running back on the open market, or even your own guy many times on that contract when he's 27 years old at or near the top of the market? Most of the time, those teams eventually express regret at making those deals. So to me, it's really wait and see. I said to Eagles fans, I know you're excited about this, and you should be excited about it because your Sundays just got more fun. You get to watch Saquon Barkley. Me, as sort of an objective analyst, I was like, I wouldn't have spent my money on a running back like that. So I'm on the record as saying that I could be wrong if he, goes off for 1,700 yards and they go to the Super Bowl. People can throw it back in my face, but that's how I felt at that moment in time.
Do you think Jalen Hurts needs to be coached to check down more, or have the Eagles just kind of really lacked a guy who can be an X factor in that regard? I think one of the things I discussed with actually Ben at the Senior Bowl was how surprised we were that DeAndre Swift didn't do more in the passing game. Do you think that was kind of a symptom of Jalen Hurts, a symptom of DeAndre Swift, or just the old stale offense in general?
I think most quarterbacks who can scramble don't check it down much. I mean, I'm having a hard time thinking of it like the scramble is their check down. You'll hear, people saying, I think that's the case with Jalen Hurts. If he's, going through his reads and it's not there and he can either throw it to the running back in the flat or he can take off himself, he's going to take off himself. I don't think that's going to change. I don't think Saquon Barkley's going to be catching a lot of checkdowns. The question is, can Saquon Barkley be like an actual factor in the passing game where he's whatever, lining up in the slot, lining up in the backfield, screens, angle routes, vertical routes, whatever the case may be. I generally think, Joe, that's something everybody talks about in May, June, July, August, and then the season comes around and we find out it's a little bit overstated. I mean, Saquon Barkley's averaged 7.3 yards per reception in his career. That's a pretty pedestrian number. He's averaged around 20 receiving yards per game the last 3 seasons. Again, that's a pretty pedestrian number. So, can he add 300 yards receiving? Like, I think that would probably be a nice outcome for them, but I don't think he's going to be a pass catching option that dramatically changes what they do.
Yeah, so like when you look at it from a fantasy perspective, the fact that the Eagles paid Saquon Barkley at least suggests on some level they view him as kind of a math changer, the way the 49ers, and I would say correctly, viewed Christian McCaffrey when they traded for him. That being said, for fantasy Sheil, Saquon Barkley is generally going in the second round. So the Eagles have A.J. Brown going in the first. They have Saquon going in the second and Devonta Smith going in the third alongside Jalen Hurts. That's really where these fantasy picks are kind of condensed. Do you think that's fair right now? The fact that the fantasy markets are expecting him to be a very, very useful player for the Eagles, but not a game changer on the way you would view maybe a Christian McCaffrey.
Yeah, I think that's probably where I would put him. I mean, I mentioned he's missed time, so you're thinking what do you expect to get out of him? 13, 14 games would be I think a nice outcome for the Eagles. I think his over under, if you look at just sort of the betting odds, is about 1,000.5 rushing yards, and I just mentioned it, 200-300 yards receiving. So yeah, I think that's fair. Around that 1,300 yards from scrimmage mark would be a nice outcome. And the touchdowns are just so hard to predict because, as we discussed earlier, if they're at the goal line, if they're at the one, are they handing it to Saquon Barkley or are they just running what's been their best play for the last 2 years? I tend to think those are still going to go to Jalen Hurts. So yeah, without having gone through everybody who's going ahead of him, like you mentioned, average draft position, just when you said that, I think that kind of makes sense to me.
And Dallas Goedert's a really kind of a guy who slipped through the cracks for the Eagles. Another guy who's missed some time. I think Dallas Goedert has been historically a better NFL player than a fantasy factor. That being said, the Eagles didn't really do a whole lot behind Dallas Goedert this offseason. I think they brought back Albert O, and really they didn't draft a tight end, unless you think Johnny Wilson's one. Do you think Dallas Goedert is a huge factor in this offense? And if he is to miss time, what the heck are they going to do at that position?
Yeah, I think it will be, really the role he's had in recent years. I think he had almost 600 receiving yards last year. I think he's been between 3 and 5 touchdowns every season of his career. So I agree with you. You watch him on film, great blocker. And when the ball is in his hands, there are moments where you say this is one of the best yards after catch tight ends in the NFL. Maybe this is a scenario where Kellen Moore helps him. Maybe again, all their playmakers should be happy that they're getting an offensive coordinator who theoretically should be an upgrade from what they've had previously there. there. So I don't know, 55, 60 catches, 600 to 700 yards, maybe 4 touch. That's like the expectation I would have for Goedert. As to who plays if he's not in there, I don't know. They signed CJ Uzama, a veteran tight end who might be reliable. They've got Alberto, like you mentioned. They've got this guy, Grant Calcaterra, certainly in the offense. So I think if those guys go in, Joe, what happened last year is when Goedert was out, they played Jack Stoll, and I could show you examples on film where Jack Stoll, the backup tight end, is standing there wide open, and he's the read, and Jalen Hurts isn't throwing him the football. So that trust, that reliability, is that going to be there with any of these guys? Unless you're, desperate, I wouldn't go near anyone else at tight end except for Dallas Goedert on this roster.
You mentioned Saquon Barkley missing time in the last 4 seasons, basically 5 games per season. Obviously, Eagle fans have their gripes with Kenny Gainwell, who Nick Sirianni seems to have a love affair with. I want to ask you about the rookie running back that they drafted out of Clemson, Will Shipley. I happen to be a Clemson season ticket holder this year, and when I was watching Shipley, who everybody in the stands is like, "Oh, he's Christian McCaffrey" for obvious reasons. My comparison actually immediately went to Kenny Gainwell. Wow. He's kind of a hard-charging, undersized guy who can catch the ball but doesn't make explosive plays. Do the Eagles just have a type behind as their backup running back? Because that was the guy I saw when I watched Will Shipley.
I see him like you do. Like, he's fine. If you need to stick him in there, he's not going to kill you. He'll get the yards that are there. He can do different things. None of them at a level where you would say, wow, this is an elite skill. That's kind of how I saw Shipley. So maybe you're right. Obviously we've seen the coaching staff does love Kenny Gainwell. So we'll see who gets the carry. I think if I had to say right now, I would say they probably still stick with Gainwell. Like, if you asked me who gets more touches, Gainwell or Shipley, I would still stick with Gainwell, but it's something to monitor. It wouldn't surprise me at all if they fell in love with Shipley and they say, okay, we've given Gainwell a shot and he doesn't have kind of the juice that we're looking for. Maybe Shipley gives us something different. But yeah, you are right. Maybe they do have a type, and I should have seen that pick coming from a mile away.
So, Sheil, obviously the Eagles have 2 elite wide receivers, A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. They're both being drafted like elite wide receivers. They both got extended this offseason, which is great for dynasty purposes. But to filter it back to the beginning of the conversation that we had, the Eagles kind of just asked guys last year to line up and beat the guy across from them. CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper had a ton of success, among other receivers, in Kellen Moore's offense in Dallas. When you watched Kellen Moore scheme those guys up in Dallas, did you notice him just kind of doing things to not just get these elite guys to win because they're elite, but also to just help them win, to get easy completions? And is that something that you think that we're going to see more with A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith this offseason?
Yeah, it's interesting with those two guys. Like you mentioned, the production has been at such a high level where it's like that doesn't need to be priority one. AJ Brown had over 1,400 yards last year. Devonta Smith had over 1,000 yards last year. But yeah, I do think there are times where it's the simple stuff. It's not reinventing football. It's, hey, can you move a guy in the slot? Can you get a little rub route going for a guy on 3rd down and create some space there? Can you move a guy in motion to get a favorable matchup for him? So yeah, I think those are the little things they're looking to add to the offense that, again, those guys have shown you could just line them up and have them run their, and they can win one-on-one over and over and over again. They've done that, but you don't always have to do that, because situationally there are going to be times where you go up against a good defense and you need a little help. And so we'll see.
Obviously, this is a very narrow fantasy team. The Eagles, the touches are going to go to the good players. But the one area that they really have lacked the last couple of years, and you saw it down the stretch last year, no depth whatsoever behind Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown, and each of those guys missed some time. If one of these guys that they maybe drafted or signed, Paris Campbell, Devontae Parker, Anais Smith, I already mentioned Johnny Wilson, which of those guys would surprise you the least if he emerged as a bit playmaker for the Eagles?
Oh man, they would all surprise me quite a bit if I'm being honest. I mean, I think Devontae Parker is probably the guy you could say, like, maybe, but is there upside for a guy who's 31 years old? I mean, the fact of the matter is they have like 1,000 snaps to account for a wide receiver 3 in the offense. And is it going to go to Parker, Campbell, Anais Smith, Johnny Wilson, Britton Covey? You can throw his name in there. I mean, I have no idea. I haven't seen it with Paris Campbell. He, to me, is a guy that coaches probably fall in love with and think they have a great plan for, and it hasn't really worked out for him. Anais Smith, Johnny Wilson, 5th and 6th round picks. You look at it historically, on average, It's about 160, 200 yards as rookie. So you're really talking about, hey, could you get a Puka Nacua or, poor man's version even of Puka Nacua out of one of these guys? So I would say Parker's probably the guy who at least is going to have that opportunity, I would think, where they'll go into training camp and he'll line up with the first team in 11 personnel. But they're probably hoping in the back of their minds, hey, if one of these young guys emerges, that would be a better outcome for us.
His name is Sheil Kapadia. You know his work from the Ringer Philly Special podcast, among others, at Sheil Kapadia on the Twitter machine. Thank you very much, Sheil, for putting up with me on this edition of the Franchise Focus podcast. It was a pleasure having you. We love your work, and we're going to be tuning into you as you try to figure out which of those number 3 receivers is going to emerge for the Eagles. Make sure you check out the Ringer Philly Special pod. Thank you, Sheil.
All right. Thanks for having me, Joe.